Welcome. It is 4 o'clock, so let's get started. Thank you all for turning out on this wet and soggy afternoon. It is my pleasure to reintroduce Dr. James Dyer. This is his third year at EOU, where he teaches in the English writing program. For those of you who are regulars to the Colloquium, you may remember that Dr. Dyer did a joint presentation last term with Dr. Jenny Slinkard, where they discussed literacy expectations at EOU through the lens of general education audits. Today, Dr. Dyer is back to talk about some work he did for his recent doctoral dissertation. A little over a year ago, he received his doctorate in education from Texas State University, specializing in post-secondary literacy and developmental education. Today, he'll be sharing some of his research related to working in a linguistically diverse classroom. Please welcome Dr. Dyer.
All right, hey y'all. So as Steve said, I'm going to be presenting on my dissertation, which took 3 years and a whole lot of tears to complete. I worked on it during my first year and change here at EOU. So I'm really excited to present it to you. Dissertations are big. If you've had a chance to write one, they're big. What I'm going to do with this presentation is, instead of running through my whole collection of findings, I'm going to focus on one in particular that I still haven't quite found what to do with. And that was specifically how instructors work with student resistance in the classroom, specifically resistance to expectations and resistance to feedback. I always say that my interest in developmental education and student support and linguistically diverse learners started with this one example of a student, Fernanda, a pseudonym, of course, who had she was working in an ESL classroom that was paired with a college writing, so first year writing classroom. So our writing 121 would be a good parallel. And we were interviewing her based on her experiences in this class and what her goals for college were. And she kept saying this over and over again: well, I'm so excited when I start normal college. When I start normal college, it's going to be like this. When I start normal college, I'm going to do this. When I start normal college, my professors are going to expect this and this from me. And I think what was really fascinating to myself and everyone on the research team is that Fernanda was in normal college. This ESL classroom was an academic ESL classroom, and she was in a first year writing class that was for credit. However, because she was seeing herself as in need of support, she felt like she hadn't started normal college yet. So this is kind of why I wanted to focus on students in this transitory period between, either high school and college, or in the students in this study's case, ESL or some kind of language support class entering into college for the first time. And specifically, again, for this one, I'll talk a little bit about what my purpose for doing research and my research questions, but I'm going to be focusing on both the feedback experiences of students in these classes and their experiences resisting or expressing resistance to feedback, specifically feedback on their written work. Actually, that was one of my most interesting findings, was that students often expressed resistance but rarely enacted resistance due to a lot of different power dynamics in the classroom. So to kind of paint the landscape for you all, my research occurs for those of us who work with first year students in this broad reform movement, which has been going on for now a couple decades, which has really kind of uprooted a lot of the ways that we used to support students through these scaffolded developmental education courses. So English 1, English 2, English 3, and then first year writing, to try to streamline things into an accelerated or co-requisite model for education, where students are often taking their first year writing course alongside a developmental support course. And these, there are a lot of studies on how students in this transitory space between developmental education and first year writing experience a lot of mismatch in expectations. and particularly when they're coming from different language backgrounds. For example, there are a lot of different linguistic expectations in a exit level ESL course that might not exist in a first year writing course where an instructor has a more open and fluid approach to grammar, for example. The other angle to this is I wanted to really peer into what actually happens in these classrooms, these developmental education spaces, where students are meant to be supported academically. So I wanted to specifically look at tasks that students were expected to complete in the classroom. And one of the ones that I found had the maybe the least amount of like really focused research was how they responded to feedback on their written assignments. Now, feedback literacy is certainly a thing that other folks have explored, but there wasn't really a lot of research into how students respond to feedback in this developmental education space. And then finally, there's an emerging body of research amongst folks who look at students from linguistically diverse backgrounds and try to understand both pedagogically and encourage them to see themselves from an asset-oriented perspective with regards to their language background. So they're not seeing, we're encouraging our students to see their, bilingual, trilingual, quadrilingual experience as an asset to be leveraged rather than a deficit to be kind of mitigated, which is in fact how a lot of our students in these language spaces are treated. However, there isn't really a lot of research in how students take advantage of these opportunities. We as instructors often position ourselves as aware of our students' language diversity. However, there isn't a lot of research in how students actually take advantage of these opportunities. So here are the research questions I developed out of all this. Essentially, I wanted to know the experience of linguistically diverse students in these co-requisite writing courses. So a developmental support course that's paired with a first year writing course. I wanted to know how students were understanding their instructors' expectations with regards to language and just general academic conventions. And I wanted to understand how these students responded to these expectations, be it in the revision process, so you take feedback and you make revisions, or just in the general, general classroom interactions. And then finally, feedback was a big part of this. I wanted to examine feedback in this space. So I wanted specifically to look at how instructor feedback in a co-requisite writing course actually affected how students saw themselves, both as college students, as English users, as budding academics, whatever identity they were bringing with them into the classroom. I wanted to see how instructor feedback was affecting that. So I promised my dissertation chair that I would include at least one rainbow in my dissertation, so challenge accepted. But I think the prism model, the prism kind of diagram actually works really well to understand the thing I was hoping to see, the phenomenon that I wanted to examine. We as, first year writing instructors, developmental instructors, applied linguistics folks, we often see our students as having cultural linguistic funds of knowledge, which essentially refers to the experiences and the resources that students bring with them into the classroom and can, in fact, exercise agency in deploying. So there's that. A student has agency in deploying these funds of knowledge, these experiences that they bring with them. However, there's also an academic context, which is often rigid. And I guess the approach to using the prism here is essentially to understand that in order for a student's funds of knowledge to be recognized as valuable in a classroom, the academic context, so the curriculum, the development of an assignment, needs to be positioned in such a way that a student can actually see that and make use of it, hence the rainbow. An example of this in action is essentially a student who sees the social norms of a classroom context. So, standard language ideologies. We have this one rigid approach to grammar that is correct or incorrect. A student seeing these rules as bendable or seeing these rules as breakable, and seeing that and employing maybe a translanguaging approach. So they're dipping in between, in one example that I'll show you, Spanish and English for a paper in a way that makes rhetorical sense. So to do all this, I'm getting kind of more into the methodology here. I took a approach that uses positioning theory, which essentially just says that students have positions that are awarded to them based on whatever role they're occupying in a space. So in a classroom, a student has a position of a student, which has different rights and responsibilities that are different than the position of an instructor. For example, a student, the norms of a teacher-student interaction are that a teacher provides feedback and a student interprets and enacts that feedback. So I'm taking this perspective and I'm filtering my interview and think aloud data through this to try to examine how students are actually enacting agency and making these decisions on their feedback in the classroom. So essentially, here's how all this looks like when it's employed, like literally. So a student would have certain expectations in a writing assignment that they would gain from, their knowledge of a typical classroom assignment. A student may recognize an opportunity to apply their cultural and linguistic assets on a paper, for example, maybe using translanguaging. However, an instructor at the end of the day wields what Bourdieu calls pedagogic authority. So it's kind of the roadblock to all of this actually being enacted, because at the end of the day, however we try to flip our classroom or flip the power dynamics in our classroom, we are still the ones responsible for assigning a grade. And students see this power dynamic oftentimes as a barrier to enacting their assets using their agency. So I guess my argument based on all this research is that all of these pieces need to be aligned if we want students to actually see their funds of knowledge as valuable in the classroom. So here's what I did. I ran a case study with 6 students who were enrolled in co-requisite first-year writing classes across the state of Texas. For folks who have had to do an IRB at multiple institutions, it's a nightmare. This was an absolute nightmare. Particularly in Texas, where colleges oftentimes aren't really interested in working with different institutions. To select my participants, I kind of have my approach to selecting participants is really important. I didn't want to frame students based on race, ethnicity, immigration status, or background. I wanted to focus on students who are self-identifying as being in some way linguistically diverse. So rather than a term like I'm looking for ESL students, which kind of belies the reality that students at some point in time cease to become ESL students, I focused instead on students that were linguistically diverse. And I worked with 3 different community colleges to recruit students from these co-requisite first-year writing classes in Texas. Working interinstitutionally in Texas was one thing that was really nice about that, and terrible about Texas, is that Texas is so rigid in how they mandate curriculum that it was pretty easy to compare apples to apples across these different contexts because the state's so into every single classroom. So again, here are my 3 research sites. The first one was a community college in Texas that had a co-requisite model that was paired, so a first-year writing class paired with an ESL class. The second was another community college in Texas that used what's called an accelerated learning program model for co-requisite instruction. This is where the same instructor is teaching both the developmental course and the first year for credit course. And the final research site was a 4-year university, which had a similar model. So an integrated reading and writing support class that was paired with a first-year writing course. And here are my participants. So I found 6, but I had to eliminate 1 due to scheduling conflicts. So my participants spanned pretty widely in terms of language background. You'd think Texas, most folks are speaking English and Spanish. However, Texas is more linguistically diverse than I think a lot of folks realize. I had a student who spoke Arabic and English, Vietnamese and English, and then one of my students who unfortunately had to drop out of the study spoke Chinese and English, on top of students who were using Spanish and English. They also varied really widely based on their ages, which was significant more so in describing their own professional and education backgrounds that they brought to the classroom. Finally, they really varied across different majors that they were seeking at these different institutions, and I'll get a little bit more into that in a second. In my data collection process, I did a series of interviews with these students. After this first interview where I got their education backgrounds, I did what are called think-alouds, so concurrent think-alouds with these students, where essentially I asked them to review a paper that they'd written for their class and review the marginal and end feedback that they received on these assignments. With the idea being that as students were doing these think-alouds, of these complete papers, they were thinking out loud. They were prompted to stop and think out loud and give their reactions to the feedback as they were receiving it in the context of their paper, and how it affected composition choices, how it affected their decisions to revise, and just how it affected their general attitudes towards the assignments that they were doing. I don't know if I have any verbal reporting nerds out here. Verbal reports are really weird and interesting. Just throwing this out here because I found it fascinating. There's a long kind of history in asking participants in research studies to do a task and then verbalize their thought process while doing these tasks. In prior research, there were theorists who thought your verbalizations reflected directly what was happening inside your head, which is really...
That's true, actually.
It's really bizarre, which I don't know if you've ever... I don't know if you've ever actually tried to do this, where you're literally verbalizing everything that's passing through your head, but it's quite a bit more complicated than that. So I did not approach my research this way. Instead, what I really wanted to look at were how it could give us insight into the context of the student assignments, and essentially use it as a way to enhance and hyper-focus the interview protocol that I had designed. So I viewed them as a research tool, as an individually accomplished event, rather than an actual reflection of direct cognition. Sorry, I always just think that part's interesting, even though it's maybe less relevant. So to present my findings, I'm going to give you a couple student vignettes where I describe students' backgrounds and the assignments that they presented. And I think this is where we get more into the interesting ways in which students resisted feedback from their instructors. And applied it in really interesting ways. My first student, Patrick, he was a safety advisor at a refinery in Saudi Arabia, and he had actually received leave from his company to study in the US to earn a degree. When we talk about his financial stability, he was quite financially stable. He was getting living expenses from his company in Saudi Arabia. Where he also had a scholarship to attend school. However, this international student status was something that was really interesting. If folks have ever worked in an ESL context, the needs of international students, so students who aren't American citizens nor are they pursuing citizenship, were very different from the majority of the rest of the class who were either citizens or pursuing citizenship or had some kind of long-term plans to reside in the United States. Patrick, on the other hand, was just here to study. He expressed a lot during our interviews about how he felt like this alienated him from his classmates. in that he struggled to make friends with folks who, maybe had lived in this, metropolitan area with their family for like 20 years or so. The essay that Patrick shared with me was about a personal narrative that meant a lot to him. It was about the first time it was about him returning home to find his brother dead. It was like a really, if anyone's taught a narrative essay in a writing class, students often write to their traumas. And this was very much kind of in that realm. Patrick really sought to deal with this through his writing, and in the end really wanted his classmates to understand how this experience had affected him. At the end of this assignment, Patrick was obviously not positive about the experiences, but positive of the, really enthusiastic about the product he'd created, to the point where he said this to me. He said, sort of in jest, but now I think I'll become a great writer. This was also in direct reflection to feedback that he received from his instructor on his abilities as a storyteller. Patrick had a really positive perception of his instructors, particularly their work ethic, which I think as an instructor, my students have never complimented me on my work ethic. But it was something that I think he saw and really appreciated in his instructors and the way that they worked together to support him in what he wanted to write. Even though, as he admitted to me several times, he was not here to become a great writer. He was here specifically to get this associate's degree for his job. Peter was another student in the same class as Patrick who had recently moved to the US from Mexico. However, he possessed dual citizenship, which he also remarked made him feel a little alienated from his classmates who were not in a similar citizenship situation. He had previous post-secondary experience, but unlike the other students in his class in the study, he really struggled socially in this setting. He was 19 years old, so he was still relatively young and had moved here to live with family that he didn't know very well. His goal was to obtain a degree in engineering, but he noted frequently that he struggled in writing both in English and in Spanish. He chose to write his essay about not quite as traumatic, but the experience of leaving his friends and family in Mexico to move to the United States. Specifically I'll call it, quote, not quite romantic friend that he was particularly sad to be leaving behind. This was probably the most subtextual that a student got in their narratives that I observed. It was, and as he admitted to me later, he had romantic feelings for this person who he had to leave behind. Next student was Lynn, who had lived in the United States for, I think, coming up on 15 years, and had emigrated as an adult from Vietnam. Lynn was really unique in that she had no career aspirations, at least when we initially met, that drove her to pursue higher education. She, as she mentioned specifically to me, came back to school to learn, period. She, in fact, during our first meeting, claimed that she didn't even really care about a degree. She just wanted to obtain more knowledge, right? Dream student right here. She had a post-secondary degree in Vietnam, was a small business owner. I believe it was a contracting company that her and her husband owned. And she, throughout our conversations, talked about having an actual specific focus that she wanted to learn more about, which was human psychology. She didn't write about this in her essay that we examined, but she talked about it kind of during our interviews. She wanted to explain why folks who hold different religious views became so spicy when interacting with folks with other religious views. Excuse me. So she was primarily interested in studying, again, just to learn, although as I found out throughout her interviews, and this will come up in a second a bit more, she actually only wanted to participate in the study because she knew I was a doctoral student and she wanted to learn more about becoming a doctoral student. Okay. So John was a student at another institution. Another community college, had moved to the U.S. when he was 18 years old from Mexico. Unlike other students in this study, he had no previous post-secondary experience. He, in fact, had to receive his GED through the same community college. Primarily, though, because his high school degree didn't transfer. Anyone who's worked with ESL students knows the absolute living hell it is to try to talk about transferring certifications from different countries, and he just couldn't figure out how to get his diploma to transfer to the United States. His immediate priority, kind of different than Lynn and even Patrick to some senses, was to work as hard as possible to finish his degree and to get a job immediately. He was working full-time at a grocery store and was working really hard to kind of support himself. However, after conversations with his family and his boyfriend, he decided that he was worth more than he felt like he was getting valued at his grocery store job. So his goal was to receive a degree to become a nurse. John, really interestingly, came from a lower SES background, a socioeconomic status background, than I think other students had claimed. And he said this in itself was a barrier to him going to college. He would talk about this frequently and about in defiant terms, this idea that just because people have more money than me doesn't mean I'm just as good as they are, doesn't mean I'm just as smart as they are. So he was really defiant about this, and in fact used this a lot to drive his, to motivate him through college. And then finally, my last participant was we might call her a more traditional college student in a four-year university, Katya. So she had traveled to college at this university really the first time she was leaving home. However, she lived her entire life in the United States. As is relatively frequent in Texas, students will grow up in language communities where Spanish is the language of primary communication. And oftentimes Texas school districts will see this and place students into ESL classes, sort of whether or not they might need it or not. There's a lot of debate about this. However, she was, among her other family members, the most proficient in English. So she was often used as a translator on official document, like in official documents for her family setting up bank accounts. She talked about how her family would have to bring her with them to order food from the drive-in. She would essentially scooch over and speak into the intercom from like the age of like 6 to help her family order. The essay she shared with me was a personal narrative about her family cooking what are called pastelitos, which are a Colombian cuisine from Michigan. Pastelitos pretty similar to pasties. You ever had a pasty before? There's interesting history as to why, but maybe that's for another presentation. Katya alone among my participants extensively translanguaged or code switched between English and Spanish. Specifically, as she was writing about her father cooking pastelitos, she code switched between English and Spanish to express her father's story in Spanish in her essay in really interesting and cool ways. And this was, in fact, at the encouragement of her instructor. So I'm only going to focus on a couple of these findings across cases, but just kind of want to throw all this up there. One of the most interesting findings, I think, as I mentioned at the start of this, we're in this long, extended, drawn-out developmental education reform movement where we've been reforming how we support students in their first years in college, probably for the past like 10, 15, 20 years. There were some really interesting findings on how students from linguistically diverse backgrounds were interacting with these co-requisite classes in ways that were kind of unexpected. The dominant finding of a lot of research on developmental support says students want less time in developmental education, so less time in these support classes. And in fact, students almost to a T expressed wanting more time in these support classes, saying they had really good relationships with their instructors, and they wanted more time to develop the academic and linguistic skills that they were learning in these classes. Students' perception of instructor expectations was really varied across different contexts, which I think was slightly surprising based on the excessive standardization of these curricula in Texas. And then the specific things I'm going to talk about in a second are how students responded to the expectations of their instructors. I think in literacy circles, we're used to talking about all different kinds of literacies, academic literacies, you can call them workplace literacies, what have you. Feedback literacy is in fact another really extensively researched area. So this is how students treat instructor feedback as an actual academic text in which they're expected to interact with it very similar to how they would interact with like a textbook or an academic journal article. They are reading them critically and determining which parts to skim or scan, which parts to directly apply, and in fact are also affected emotionally oftentimes by the feedback they're getting. So when I talk about feedback literacy in this study, I think one really important finding was the difficulty students had in managing what's called affect and how they read through their feedback. One really interesting, maybe slightly obvious finding is that students' perception of their whole paper was often defined by their final grade, which meant a lot of times students were ignoring really important pieces of critical feedback on assignments where they received an A. Now, this is not an argument to give students lower grades than they deserve, but it is something that I think is important for us as instructors to notice. Particularly in John's case, he kind of had the inverse problem, where he received a lot of critical feedback in the margins about things he was expected to do, and then was surprised to find that he'd received an A. In fact, in the course of our Think Aloud, he had forgotten that he'd received so high a grade on this assignment because of the nature of the critical feedback he was receiving. Interestingly, also, as students were going through this feedback, they had certain identities that were embedded and that were expressed in their interviews with me. Patrick, the student from Saudi Arabia, was a really interesting example in that he kept explaining to me about how he saw himself as a storyteller. In the class I observed with Patrick, in fact, his instructor had to kind of call him off as he was kind of dominating the classroom discussions with telling these stories about his experience in Saudi Arabia, something his daughters had done during recess the previous day. So Patrick's perception of a storyteller was maintained even when his instructor challenged certain storytelling mechanics that Patrick was bringing to the class. There's a really important practical dimension of feedback literacy that was also prevalent throughout my findings, and that there is an important difference between what's called an effort and an aesthetic stance towards a text. Composition folks are familiar with Louise Rosenblatt, who talked about how you would interpret a literary text in this way. You're appreciating it aesthetically, so you're appreciating it for the inherent beauty or the quality, or you're reading a text effortly to try to gain a specific piece of knowledge from it. Feedback works often the same way. For those of us who are fluffy like me, I leave a lot of really happy like, this is awesome, or whoa, this is crazy, in the margins that students are meant to take aesthetically. They're meant to see it as an appreciation of the work they submitted. However, there was a real confusion among students on the difference between that and specific guidance that they were meant to take and apply in their revisions. So which feedback and for what purpose is another really important question when it comes to students understanding feedback. Specifically, my students oftentimes ignored marginal feedback for the feedback that came at the end that was directly scrooched up next to their final grade on the assignment. The majority of my students were looking at feedback using Canvas's annotation feature, which I use in my classes. You essentially annotate in the speed grader function and leave little highlights and comments and notes. However, some students struggled to access this on their phones, which was where they were reading most of their feedback. Oftentimes, so we don't have access to this, but there are certain programs that will leave automatic grammatical feedback for students. That is essentially like an AI chatbot that gives grammatical feedback. And students were unclear on which feedback was more important. Students, like me, are often quick to discount this AI written feedback. And they were oftentimes unclear which feedback was coming from their professors and which feedback was coming from the AI grammar chatbot. So students' perceptions of their own funds of knowledge were a really interesting thing to observe here, more so in how they carried with them through these different contexts, the different papers they were writing, and their experiences in talking to me about them. John, for example, was my student from Mexico who worked really hard to get his GED in the United States, had a really strong perception of his own work ethic, and a really kind of narrow, shallow perception of his classmates' work ethic, which meant that he highly valued the feedback he received from his instructor, and to say that he valued his peers' feedback little would be, I think, undercutting it. In fact, to the point where he mentioned this in class, he really appreciated, his instructor had noticed how, like, facial expressions, how unsatisfied he was with his peers' feedback in class, and actually came over to talk to him after class to make sure he was okay. He had similar experiences at the Writing Center, which he was required to go to for his class, and the feedback he received from the tutors. And I think this was closely tied to his, not necessarily the quality of peer feedback or the quality of the Writing Center tutors, but more to his biographical information. So John was someone who came from a background where, because of his income class, he was not expected to go to college. Colleges, as his family said, were for the rich. And I think he saw a lot of his classmates and the tutors and the other staff that he worked with as representative of what a college student is supposed to be, versus what he saw himself as. Patrick's perception of a storyteller was often called into question by the feedback he received, specifically by what he called his instructor's practice of over-commenting, which is never something someone said about me in my feedback that I give. I think that professor is probably working a lot harder than I was. But he recognized the positive feedback he was receiving that was supporting this identity that he saw himself as a storyteller, and often rejected what he saw as over-commenting, not on grammar feedback, but more on story details, as I'll talk about in a second. Katya, she saw her translanguaging abilities kind of really celebrated in her composition classroom, and actually expressed that in her written work. She said she felt recognized for her language background and felt comfortable taking risks in writing in English and Spanish, a language which her instructor had told her he does not speak. However, she felt rejected when her instructor failed to notice her purposeful grammar use when she was making translations from Spanish to English. Because she was writing in Spanish, made sure to provide translations so her instructor, and so I, could understand what she was writing about. However, the grammatical choices that she made were reflective of her father's Spanish, and were in fact being corrected by her instructor, who didn't understand that she was trying to quote her father directly. Finally, this student's identity and how they enacted it in their class and their class participation was really interesting. Again, Patrick saw himself as a storyteller. This was affirmed by his instructor, who often remarked on his really detailed descriptions in his writing. However, this affected also how he responded to more critical feedback on those very descriptions. He In fact, in calling this out, made a really salient point when he said his instructor had asked him to, he was walking up the stairs to his brother's apartment. His instructor asked him to describe the tension, describe the feeling of the staircase on your feet, describe the air temperature. And he said, essentially, these details to me weren't relevant. And he said, the writer's not going to write everything all the time. Sometimes he has to let you guess. And that's essentially what he wanted his readers to feel in this moment, in a way that really wasn't understood and respected by his instructor, who had more detail in that moment. For John, he, I think, safe to say, had a bit of a chip on his shoulder based on his background and his work ethic coming in compared to his classmates, whom he saw as lazy. He quite frequently remarked that his classmates were lazy. And he was he valued this work ethic, and again, saw himself as someone who could overcome these barriers that were put in front of him in college. And all of this made him really skeptical of the community aspect of writing that a lot of us as writing teachers are really seeking to instill in the classroom. In response to, you can see what he thought of people who would doubt his abilities as a writer. Really interestingly, so Lynn had a fascinating perspective with her analysis essay, where I think she did a lot of what we would really want our students to do in a first-year writing context, where she was taking a lot of initiative to creatively analyze something and analyze the cultural effect that something has. She was analyzing a work of art, the great hand of, it's a Welsh sculpture. It's like a forest hand in the forest. It's really weird, carved out of a tree stump. And she was making all these claims about what she thought the sculpture meant, which I think is, again, what we as instructors would want our students to do in an analysis context. However, her instructor kept saying, you need to cite a source. You need to cite a source. To the point where Lynn, in reflecting on this feedback, had said, well, I feel like I don't think I can talk about my personal ideas because I'm not an expert. I don't have a doctorate yet. So my opinion isn't valuable. I need to cite the opinions of others. And she, in fact, had made the claim that, maybe if I had this doctorate in religion, I wouldn't need to cite outside sources because my perspective would be valuable enough. Peter, he had interesting narrative choices that he made in his essay, and I think he took a piece of feedback that I, in fact, have also given to my students and pointed in how problematic it could be. Peter had written this narrative where he was leaving his friends, his romantic interest, for the last time, and he was very sad, as any of us would be. And the feedback he received on this paper was well, how are you going to write a conclusion for this? You need to include a lesson or a moral at the end of this story. To which Peter replied, well, I don't know the moral of this, I'm just sad. And for his first draft, he received a poor grade, and he commented to me when I asked him if he changed it or not, yeah, I just wrote it because I wanted to submit the homework. It doesn't make any sense, he said, and he reread what he revised, essentially this fake moral on how, we should value what we have before we have to leave it or whatever. He said, right now I see it, and it's like, why did I even write this? What was the point of me even writing this in the first place? So these examples that I showed you, I think, are reasons why it's really important to pay attention to the nuanced ways in which students are resisting and try to understand where this resistance may be coming from. For example, the resistance played a major role in a lot of the responses, while in the same respect, my students also mentioned having a lot of respect and compassion for their instructors. Each of the students viewed their instructors as a really important support system that they could rely on. In that same breath, they also expressed resistance to these pieces of feedback that challenged things that they saw or believed about themselves. So examples: resistance to over-commenting, this conclusion that included a lesson, grammar feedback that was over-commenting, or group work. However, in all of these situations, resistance was expressed, but did not actually turn into realized enactment of resistance. No students commented to me that they actually decided, like, screw it, I'm not going to write this moral to this story. Forget it, I'm not going to have control over the details that I provide. They all mentioned twisting themselves and their narratives into different ways to kind of fit the assignment that they were meant to complete. So I think what this explains is the nature of resistance in classes. By its very nature, funds of knowledge, of which resistance may be one, right? This ability to see yourself as someone who can resist when you are, attacked both literally and have your identity attacked. It's a fund of knowledge, but oftentimes cannot overcome these entrenched inequalities in the classroom, right? As an instructor, I want my students to push back on me, right? And I'm going to stand up here and say that I want that. However, that needs to understand that oftentimes students understand consequences that come with that resistance. However, I think really importantly, the practice of resistance, while it might not have value in the classroom, it certainly has value outside of a space where students have more control. An example of this would be, Patrick describing himself as a storyteller and about how that identity was attacked in the classroom via his feedback. This did not change Patrick's aspirations towards maybe becoming a writer one day. As Patrick explained to me, he saw it as he doesn't have control in this situation, but in talking through this resistance, he understood maybe he would have control in a situation outside of the classroom, where he'd have more control over what he was writing about. So at the end of the day, resistance is what? A bunch of folks have talked about theories of resistance, one of which being an effort to claim an identity that is actively being repressed through different norms or expectations. Another is an idea that resistance, at its very core, is a student enacting agency that is, again, mitigated by those inequalities in the classroom. What I think my students showed me in this sense is that while resistance may be, quote, futile, in a space where a student doesn't have pedagogic authority, or in a space where a student doesn't wield, cultural capital or power, a student this resistance might have transformative potential outside of the classroom. So even though this resistance wasn't enacted, the expressed resistance showed students facets of their identity that could then be applied in outside spaces. For example, Patrick seeing himself as a writer, Lynn, who saw herself as not yet able to express opinions without this degree, she was seeking this power to be able to express these opinions. Katya realizing the authority that she could wield through using Spanish and English on an assignment. Saw how this was valuable in other spaces, and in fact her educational goals were to work with in a K-12 setting where she could teach in a bilingual classroom to show students this very thing. So instead of practical, approaches to dealing with resistance in the classroom, I think what I found is I don't really have these answers yet. I can certainly talk more about how I try to address these questions in the classroom, but here are some questions that I think were really important to end with. First, how can we create an academic context where students can actually exercise agency in how they meet our intended course outcomes? And then second, how does a student's prior experiences maybe influence their decisions to express or not agency or resistance in meeting these outcomes? And then finally, I think if we take one thing away, I think all of us who are faculty here give feedback on our students' work in one way or another. And I think it's important to see, as my students kind of exemplified, feedback is a two-way street. I think talk about feedback a lot of times as we are the arbiters of truth in giving our feedback, and students need to just understand the feedback that we give. But feedback really is a two-way street. Much as writers write for an audience, I think in giving feedback, we need to understand how that feedback is going to be taken in by an audience. And this is important just for equity issues, but also in ensuring our feedback is actually taken up by our students. So yeah, I think that's it. I think today added a new cat to our list of cats, so yeah. Thanks y'all, I guess any questions and stuff?
Thank you. Any questions?
Thank you so much, James. I think this topic of resistance is incredibly important. And I think from my own experience, I have these moments in my own learning, even now as an almost 60-year-old person, where I am resistant to what I'm being told to do, feedback to me, and on down the line. But what I find is sometimes I just need to process things. And resistance is part of how I process. I just say, oh no, I don't think that, I'm not doing that, that makes me uncomfortable. But then there's a recursive process where it goes back into my mind, and I'm better able sometimes to accept or align myself with the thing that I felt resistance to in the first place. So I'm curious, do you think that maybe this is a question about your research design. Did you work with students over time? Did you see a softening of resistance as potentially also their part of their learning process? Do you see ways in which faculty could invite resistance as a learning tool, and then also be ready for that softening or the changing of the reaction?
Yeah, I think one of the things that made the Think Aloud design so cool, I met with these students over the course, one of them I met 4 times over the course of a couple months. And one of the things I saw during the Think Aloud protocol portion is students initially react to a comment and then read more feedback and think aloud as they go and actually reflect back. So it wasn't a linear process of reading, it was bouncing all around like, oh, maybe that's what she meant by giving this comment. You had what was your other question? It was really,
What can teachers do to facilitate that?
I didn't talk about this because it's kind of whenever you ask an instructor to do one thing, you have to argue for them to prioritize this over the millions of other things that are. And I do think there's something here, I've tried it out a little bit, in offering opportunities for multimodal feedback, which is a fancy way to say like feedback via conversations with a student. I had one instructor who actually really inspired me down this path where she would record feedback as an audio track to students' papers. So again, it's an argument over the myriad number of things you have to do as an instructor. Why should I add this on top? I think there is some benefit, but again, you gotta prioritize that, which is more important. But I've tried a little bit of that past couple of terms. It's gone kind of cool. Thank you for the question.
Can I go next? Okay, great. Thanks, James. Yeah, it's interesting to hear your talk again, right? Maybe the 3rd time, but I always have more questions when I'm listening. So yeah, I was thinking kind of similarly to Nancy, as this like in hearing feedback or response to your writing kind of as a way to bring to students' minds that, oh, they have choices. So maybe they haven't actually thought, like I was thinking this about the student who was writing about his finding his brother, right? And he didn't want to include those feelings. But I wonder if sometimes students don't know that they don't want to include that until they've been asked to include it, right? So that like by offering feedback, even if students resist it or don't take it up, it like brings to their mind that, oh, I have autonomy here. I can make a decision here and see that as like filling out my toolbox. I was also thinking about, sorry, this beginning is just like responses and things I'm thinking about. The resistance, I'm thinking about this with yours too, Nancy, even as a professional, resistance, I think for me is sometimes testing the boundaries, like what are my possibilities here, taking a risk as I join a community of practice, or try to assert my own ideas on that community, but as a risk taking, like you don't know what you can do until you push the boundary, right? Until you get smacked back, which may be feeling like some of us feel like that's what's happening currently. But I did have a question too. I was wondering about how you see resistance being different here with the students that you have. Like some of our students are linguistically diverse, but not all of them, right? Or not all in the same way that those are. And I was also thinking about how I think resistance that I see in my classes is very passive. It's less like commenting back and more shutting down. And so if you have any thoughts about that. Thanks, sorry for my long-winded.
Yeah, I think there certainly is a need to differentiate different kinds of resistance. For example, all the students in this study had a lot of respect for their instructors. That is not always the case when students are resisting in the classroom, right? Not all resistance comes from a place of respect and desire to actually engage in a classroom. But I will say, I do believe an active resistance, even shutting down and not like deciding not to participate, is an expression of agency. It's just, what is the agency in service of? Does that answer your question? I don't really have a good answer. For what it looks like here, I think I experience more of that in my classes than I do of my students like willfully and openly pushing back. Interestingly though, I will say, while the students were really open to discussing resistance with me, none of them had discussed any of this resistance with their instructors. So there was certainly, even though these students had a lot of respect for their instructors, that power imbalance, I think, prevented a lot of those conversations from taking place.
Any other questions?
Hi, James. Thank you. So you said that most of the resistance was not enacted, but that does imply that some of it was enacted. So I was just curious, what feedback or where was the resistance like actually enacted by the students? What were the consequences? And I guess sort of like theoretically, is there like a difference in the benefits or drawbacks to learning when the resistance is actually enacted versus not?
Yeah, that one I really don't know. I wasn't around to see the actual impact. I do know, so for example, Patrick did not go back through and describe what the stair banister felt like while he was walking up the stairs to find his brother dead. But essentially it was really interesting. He didn't say, I'm doing this to stick it to my professor. I think the implication was he wasn't going to do it and he was going to accept the consequences as they came. Interestingly though, I did know his instructor, and I think she certainly would have been okay with both his explanation and how he enacted this. But it was never really like out and out like, you know, I'm going to stick it to my professor. It was more, I think, passive. Yeah.
I'm curious if it was difficult for you to sort of take off your writing instructor hat when doing this research. Because I know if I were doing this for my discipline and I was talking to a student who was giving their reaction to feedback, and I knew that they were misinterpreting something. My gut reaction would be to put on my math teacher's hat and say, no, that's not what they meant, but that completely biases your study. How difficult was that for you, and what sort of tools did you use to overcome what must have been that tendency?
Steve, it was so goddamn hard. Yeah, because this is also the space that I work in with the students that I work with. In fact, Lynn, who I kind of implied sort of joined my study under false pretenses, did in fact primarily want my feedback on her writing assignments, which I had to, of course, refuse, which crushed my soul. But I think she understood and kind of respected that that was part of this process. And she did, I kind of gently nudged her, was like, well, but there are other things on campus that you can access to help you with this that aren't me. But yeah, it was really, really hard. I think I did a lot of like, oh, I don't really know what I'm talking about, kind of, you don't want my feedback, I'm bad at grammar kind of stuff. Yeah, it was really, really difficult, but really only with that one student. The other students, I think, were pretty, like kind of understood what the game was.
Have you considered expanding this work to connect to other interdisciplinary literature fields? Because I'm seeing a lot echoed in like psychological reactance literature and reactance to threats to autonomy and freedom in playing out in a very similar way here.
Yeah, one of the things I've noticed, because EOU is so small, is that so many different disciplines have such different ways to talk about the same things. But yeah, I'd be fascinated to see. I'm always interested in disciplinary literacies as opposed to kind of traditional first-year writing context. I'm really interested in how this gets applied in other spaces. I'm actually working with another research team in a nursing context to do not exactly feedback literacy, but to explore students' identity enactment in curricula in similar ways. So hell yeah, I want to come do research with some psychology folks.